The moment I realized someone was stealing my packages, my stomach dropped, because this wasn't just about missing boxes anymore, it was about being watched, tested, and underestimated, and if you stay with me until the end, you'll see exactly how one entitled HOA Karen exposed herself in the most unforgettable way possible. It started quietly, the way most neighborhood nightmares do. A delivery notification buzzed on my phone while I was at work, photo proof showing a box resting neatly against my front door. When I got home, the porch was empty. No box. No note. No sign of damage. Just absence. I brushed it off at first, blaming a mix-up or a delayed scan. But the next week, it happened again. Different package. Same result. Delivered. Gone. I checked with neighbors, the delivery company, even my local post office. Everyone shrugged. That's when I started noticing her. Karen. Mid-50s. Perfect blowout. Clipboard always tucked under her arm like a badge of authority. She was the self-appointed enforcer of our HOA, famous for fining people over trash cans being inches out of place. Every time I pulled into my driveway, she was watching, pretending to admire hedges or adjust a yard sign. Always close. Always curious. The third package vanished on a rainy Thursday afternoon. This time, it wasn't cheap. I stood in my living room, staring through the blinds, replaying every interaction in my head. Then I remembered something important: Karen hated me. I'd once challenged an HOA fine she issued while standing in my own garage. Ever since, her smiles were sharp, her greetings forced. Suspicion turned into certainty. That night, I reviewed my doorbell footage. There she was. Hood up. Sunglasses on. Moving fast, but not fast enough. She scooped up my box like it belonged to her and walked calmly across my lawn. No hesitation. No fear. Just entitlement. Anger surged, but I didn't call the police. Not yet. Karen thrived on confrontation and paperwork. If I accused her outright, she'd deny everything and hide behind HOA bylaws. I needed proof she couldn't talk her way out of. Something public. Something undeniable. That's when the idea hit me, vivid and perfect, and I smiled for the first time all week. Once the anger settled, something sharper took its place: clarity. Karen didn't just steal my packages, she assumed I was powerless, that I'd complain quietly or eat the loss. That assumption was her biggest mistake, because instead of reacting emotionally, I started planning, and by the end of that night, I knew exactly how to expose her without saying a single word. The first rule was simple: the trap had to be legal. No booby traps, no injuries, no technicalities she could twist into a lawsuit. I spent hours researching porch piracy deterrents, reading forums, watching videos, learning from people who'd been burned before. Most ideas were too obvious: fake boxes, alarms, glitter bombs. Karen was cautious. She wore disguises. She checked surroundings. I needed something subtle enough to pass inspection, but permanent enough to tell the truth. That's when I discovered industrial marking dye. It's designed to stain skin and fabric on contact, invisible until activated by moisture. Banks use similar dye packs to mark stolen cash. It's non-toxic, legal to purchase, and notoriously hard to remove. Some versions last days. Others, weeks. I ordered it immediately. Next came the container. I chose a sturdy cardboard box, identical to my usual deliveries. Inside, I placed a smaller sealed plastic case containing the dye, rigged to burst when opened. The key was pressure: no explosions, no mess on my porch. Only activation once someone violated the box. I practiced the mechanism twice, adjusting until it released smoothly. Clean. Silent. Effective. But proof mattered more than punishment. So I upgraded my security setup. I added a second camera, hidden, angled directly toward Karen's usual approach path. I adjusted lighting. I tested blind spots. If she took the bait, I wanted everything documented from start to finish, including her reaction. Especially her reaction. The final touch was timing. Karen usually struck mid-afternoon, when most people were at work and the street was quiet. I requested delivery for a Tuesday, knowing her HOA board meeting was scheduled that evening. The irony made me chuckle. If all went well, she'd walk into that meeting wearing her crime. The box arrived right on schedule. I placed it carefully on my porch, making sure the label looked ordinary. Nothing flashy. Nothing tempting beyond the promise of ownership she believed she deserved. I left for work, heart pounding, checking my phone far more than usual. By noon, the camera alert came through. Motion detected. My pulse spiked as I opened the feed, already knowing who I'd see. Karen stepped into frame, hood up, sunglasses on, scanning the street like a thief who'd done this too many times to count. Karen didn't rush. That was the most unsettling part. She stood on my porch like she owned it, shoulders relaxed, head tilted, pretending to read the label while her eyes flicked toward the street. When she bent to lift the box, my breath caught, because this was the moment everything changed, whether she knew it or not. She carried the package across my lawn and disappeared out of frame. I nearly cursed, worried she'd open it somewhere off camera, ruining the payoff. Then the second camera triggered. Karen had stopped beside her car, right there in broad daylight, unable to wait another second. She sliced the tape with a key and folded the flaps open. Nothing happened at first. She frowned, annoyed, clearly expecting something valuable. Then the die activated. A deep, violent red mist bloomed upward, coating her hands, wrists, and the front of her beige sweater. Karen froze. For half a second, she didn't understand what she was seeing. Then she screamed. Not a startled gasp, but a full-throat, furious shriek that echoed down the street. She dropped the box, stumbling backward, staring at her hands like they'd betrayed her. She tried wiping the dye on her jeans. It spread. She rubbed harder. It spread more. Rain from earlier drizzled again, making it worse, the color darkening, soaking into fabric and skin. Panic replaced anger as she realized this wasn't coming off. She rushed to her car, fumbling with the door handle, smearing red across the paint. She yanked open the door, sat down, then leapt back out, terrified of staining the interior. Her HOA clipboard fell onto the pavement, instantly splattered, the white paper turning pink before my eyes. I watched, stunned, exhilarated, a little scared by how fast karma worked. Karen finally drove away, leaving red footprints across the sidewalk like a confession trail. Minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another alert. Someone was approaching my porch. This time, it wasn't Karen. It was her husband, face pale, eyes wide, holding the ruined box like evidence. He stared directly into the camera, shaking his head slowly, as if apologizing without words. The footage saved automatically, backed up twice, every angle clear enough to ruin any lie. I sat at work pretending to answer emails, replaying the clip, imagining explanations collapsing. This wasn't revenge anymore, it was exposure. By evening, everyone would notice. The stain was bright, unmistakable, and symbolic, a mark she couldn't hide from neighbors, board members, or herself, no matter how loudly she protested, denied, or blamed anyone else. The truth was already walking ahead of her, visible wherever she went. With nowhere left to. The news spread faster than I expected. By the time I got home that evening, neighbors were already clustered in small knots along the sidewalk, whispering, pointing, pretending not to stare. Karen's driveway was empty, but the evidence lingered everywhere. Red smears stained the curb. Dots of dye marked the concrete like breadcrumbs leading straight to her front door. I parked and stepped out, acting confused. Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down hurried over, eyes wide, voice low. She asked if I'd seen Karen lately. I told her no, asked why. She hesitated, then said Karen had shown up at the HOA meeting looking like a crime scene. Apparently, the dye had soaked through her sleeves, collar, even her hairline. She tried washing it off in the bathroom sink before the meeting, only making it worse. At the meeting, Karen claimed vandalism, sabotage, a targeted attack against a board member. But the moment someone asked why she'd opened a package addressed to me, the room went silent. She stammered, pivoted, blamed confusion. That excuse collapsed when the treasurer mentioned porch theft complaints matching my address. The board requested proof. I hadn't even offered it yet. Back home, my doorbell rang. 2 board members stood there, awkward and tense, asking if I'd experienced stolen packages. I invited them in and showed the footage. No commentary. No embellishment. Just timestamps, angles, and Karen's unmistakable face. One of them exhaled sharply. The other rubbed her temples. They thanked me and left, saying they'd handle it. The handling was swift. Karen was removed from the board pending investigation. A neighborhood email went out about zero tolerance for theft. Packages started appearing again, untouched. People smiled at me differently now, with relief, with respect. Even delivery drivers seemed more careful. Late that night, I received a message from Karen's husband. Short. Apologetic. He said she'd been under a lot of stress and that they'd reimburse me for everything. I replied politely, declined payment, and saved the message. Some lessons cost more than money. As I turned off the lights, I realized the dye had done more than mark a thief. It revealed a truth the neighborhood needed to see, one stain at a time, until accountability finally stuck. Sleep didn't come easily. I replayed the day, the whispers, the looks, the quiet justice settling into place. For once, the rules Karen worshipped had protected the people she bullied. I felt no triumph, only calm. Tomorrow would bring fallout, appeals, maybe anger. But the cameras were on, the truth archived, and the neighborhood had learned vigilance. Sometimes accountability arrives loudly. Other times, it stains slowly, impossible to ignore, until everyone finally agrees to look. And when it does, excuses fade, power shifts, and people breathe. If I thought exposure would end it, I underestimated Karen's refusal to accept consequences. The next morning proved that clearly. I woke to an email titled "Formal Notice," sent to the entire HOA mailing list. Karen had written it herself. Long, dramatic. Carefully worded. She claimed she was the victim of an intentional chemical attack, orchestrated to humiliate her and undermine her authority. She never mentioned the packages. By noon, a printed version appeared taped to the community mailbox. Red fingerprints marked the edges, faint but unmistakable. People noticed. Phones came out. Whispers followed her story like a shadow she couldn't escape. Karen was trying to rewrite the narrative, but the stains told a different one. That afternoon, she showed up at my door with 2 board members and a printed copy of HOA bylaws. The dye had faded slightly, but not enough. Her hands were still pink. Her sweater was darker around the cuffs, permanently ruined. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked desperate. She accused me of entrapment, of endangerment, of violating community safety standards. I listened quietly while the board members shifted uncomfortably. When she finished, I asked one question: why was she opening my packages? Silence answered for her. One board member cleared his throat and said the HOA had no authority over residents' delivered mail. Karen snapped that she was just inspecting. No one believed it. I offered to play the footage again. Karen refused, loudly. That refusal mattered more than any accusation she made. The board members exchanged looks, thanked me, and told Karen they'd be in touch. She stormed off, shouting about lawsuits and conspiracies, leaving more pink marks on my porch railing. 2 days later, the official notice arrived. Karen was permanently removed from the HOA board. Fines she'd issued unfairly were under review. A new policy required written proof before any violation. The power she'd wielded for years dissolved quietly, not with applause, but with signatures. That evening, neighbors stopped by one. Some thanked me. Others apologized for staying silent. One admitted Karen had taken a package from him too. Another said she'd once threatened to tow his car over chalk markings. Stories poured out, matching pieces of a pattern no one had challenged before. Karen stopped leaving her house. Curtains stayed closed. Her husband collected the mail now. The dye faded slowly, but her reputation didn't. Accountability had settled in, heavier than embarrassment, quieter than outrage, but far more permanent. Weeks passed, and with each one, it became clear that Karen's downfall wasn't a moment, it was a slow unraveling. The dye faded from her skin, then from her clothes, but the mark she'd left on the neighborhood refused to disappear. People noticed patterns they'd ignored for years, and once seen, they couldn't be unseen. The HOA held a special meeting to review complaints filed under Karen's tenure. The list was longer than anyone expected. Fines issued without warnings. Selective enforcement. Threatening emails. One family revealed they'd almost moved because of her harassment. Another admitted they'd paid fines they never deserved, just to avoid confrontation. What started as a review turned into a reckoning. Karen tried to attend that meeting. She sat in the back, arms crossed, jaw tight. When residents began speaking, her face hardened. When the stories grew more specific, she stood and interrupted, calling them lies. That was when the president asked her to leave. Not angrily. Calmly. Firmly. The room went quiet as Karen grabbed her purse and stormed out, the door closing behind her like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Outside the HOA, consequences followed too. A police report was quietly filed about the package thefts, backed by footage. No arrest was made, but a formal warning went on record. That mattered more than people realized. Karen had applied to join a city beautification committee the year before. Her application was denied shortly after the warning surfaced. Power, once lost, rarely returns. On my end, life improved in small but meaningful ways. Packages stayed on porches. Neighbors chatted more. People waved. There was a new sense of shared watchfulness, not suspicion, but community. We looked out for each other now, not because we were forced to, but because we'd learned what silence enabled. One evening, Karen's husband approached me while I was watering the lawn. He looked tired. Older. He apologized again, more sincerely this time. He said she'd blamed everyone but herself, that she still insisted she'd done nothing wrong. He also said they were considering moving. I nodded, wished him well, and meant it. That night, I reviewed the footage one last time before archiving it. I realized the dye trap had never been about humiliation. It was about visibility. Once the truth was visible, everything else followed naturally: accountability, change, relief. Some lessons announce themselves loudly. Others arrive quietly and stay forever. Karen learned hers the hard way, and the neighborhood learned ours together. Just when it felt like the story was winding down, life decided it wasn't finished teaching lessons. The twist came quietly, wrapped in an envelope, slipped through my mail slot one calm Saturday morning. No return address. Just my name, written carefully, almost nervously. Inside was a handwritten letter that changed how I saw everything that had happened. It was from Karen. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was fragmented, uneven, like someone writing while arguing with themselves. She admitted to taking the packages. Not just mine, others too. She said it started small, convincing herself she was protecting the neighborhood by inspecting deliveries. Over time, that justification warped into entitlement. She wrote that power felt addictive, especially when no one challenged it. Then came the part I didn't expect. Karen confessed the dye incident had shattered something she couldn't rebuild. Not her reputation, but her illusion. Seeing the stain spread, realizing everyone could see what she'd done, forced her to confront a version of herself she'd spent years denying. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't deserve it. She only wanted me to understand that the exposure had worked in a way punishment never could. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. I didn't feel sympathy exactly, but I felt closure. The story had come full circle, not with shouting or lawsuits, but with reflection. A week later, the HOA announced new leadership and new rules. Transparency measures. Open forums. Anonymous reporting channels. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but her absence shaped every decision. The community had learned what unchecked authority looked like, and no one wanted to repeat it. Then came the final surprise. A local news outlet reached out. Someone had anonymously tipped them off about a neighborhood stopping a serial porch thief through legal means. They wanted to feature it as a story about community accountability. I declined to be interviewed, but I allowed them to use the footage anonymously. The segment aired quietly, without names or addresses, but the message was clear: accountability doesn't require violence, only truth. Neighbors texted me afterward, proud, relieved. One said the story helped them confront an issue in their own HOA. Another said it gave them courage to speak up at work. The ripple spread farther than I ever intended. That night, I threw away the last remnants of the dye container. The trap had done its job. Not just exposing Karen, but reminding everyone, including me, that power fades when light hits it. After everything settled, I expected life to return to normal. Instead, something better happened. The neighborhood didn't just recover from Karen's reign, it evolved. The tension that once hovered over every driveway and mailbox slowly dissolved, replaced by something unfamiliar but welcome: trust. Small changes showed up first. Neighbors started introducing themselves properly, not just nodding in passing. People shared delivery schedules, offered to hold packages, texted when something looked off. A group chat formed, not run by the HOA, but by residents. It wasn't about enforcement. It was about awareness. We watched out for one another, not out of fear, but out of respect. The new HOA leadership made a point of visibility. Meetings were open, recorded, and summarized in plain language emails. Fines required evidence and discussion. Complaints could be challenged without retaliation. It felt strange at first, like we were learning how to live without a constant threat hanging over us. But gradually, the relief settled in. For me, the biggest change was internal. I realized how close I'd come to accepting injustice just because it was inconvenient to fight. Before the dye trap, I'd told myself it wasn't worth the hassle, that it was easier to reorder packages and move on. Karen thrived on that silence. Once broken, it never fully returned. I found myself speaking up more in general. At work. In meetings. In everyday situations where I might have stayed quiet before. Not aggressively, not angrily, but firmly. The experience had rewired something in me. Accountability didn't feel intimidating anymore. It felt necessary. Karen and her husband eventually moved. No announcement. No goodbye. One day, the house was listed. A month later, it was empty. When new owners arrived, the neighborhood welcomed them warmly, determined not to repeat old patterns. The red stains on the sidewalk had long since washed away, but the memory lingered just enough to keep everyone honest. Sometimes, I wondered if I'd gone too far. That thought came less often as time passed. The truth was simple: consequences weren't something I created. They were something Karen triggered herself. All I did was stop absorbing the damage quietly. On a calm evening months later, a package sat on my porch for hours while I was out. When I got home, it was exactly where it should be. Untouched. I stood there longer than necessary, appreciating the ordinary piece of it. That's when I understood the real outcome. The dye trap wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a community that refused to look away again. The story didn't end with a stain on a sweater or a resignation email. It ended quietly, the way real lessons do, settling into everyday life until they become invisible, guiding choices without announcing themselves. Months later, I rarely thought about Karen, but I often thought about what happened when one person finally refused to stay silent. That refusal didn't make me brave. It made me honest, and honesty turned out to be far more disruptive than anger ever could. I learned something important: power survives on assumption. The assumption that no one will push back. The assumption that rules are weapons, not safeguards. The assumption that embarrassment is worse than accountability. When those assumptions collapse, control collapses with them. The dye trap became a story neighbors told cautiously, then openly, then with a laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it reminded people that fairness doesn't require permission. It requires attention. Sometimes I think about how easily this could have gone differently. I could have shouted, threatened, or let resentment rot quietly. None of that would have changed anything. The truth only mattered once it was visible, undeniable, and shared. That's why I'm telling this story. Not to celebrate revenge, but to show what happens when ordinary people document, prepare, and refuse to be intimidated. You don't need authority to defend boundaries. You need clarity, patience, and the courage to let consequences speak. The porch is quiet now. Packages arrive. Neighbors wave. Rules make sense. And every time I see a box waiting safely, I remember this: accountability doesn't need noise. It needs light. That doesn't mean every conflict needs a dramatic solution. Most of the time, calm documentation, communication, and persistence are enough. What matters is refusing to normalize being wronged. Silence feels peaceful, but it often protects the wrong person. I don't regret the trap. I regret how long it took me to act. If this story does anything, I hope it shortens that delay for someone else. Because when people realize they're being watched by the truth, behavior changes. And when communities choose transparency over fear, everyone benefits. That was the real exposure.